Brandon's flashlight beam caught the rusted steel hatch, buried 3 feet down in the storm drain, and his blood ran cold. The warning was still legible after 70 years. Do not PEN 1953, authorized personnel only. His hands shook as he radioed dispatch, but they had no record of it, no blueprints, no permits, nothing. The city engineer who rushed to the scene went pale when he saw the federal insignia stamped below the warning. What was the government hiding beneath their streets in 1953, and why was it starting to leak? The October morning had started like any other for Brandon Carter, 22 years maintaining the city's infrastructure, and he thought he'd seen everything. The persistent water leak reports from Maple Street had been coming in for weeks, and the residents were getting angry. Standard procedure: check the storm drains, clear any blockages, file the paperwork. But when his flashlight illuminated that hatch, everything changed. Brandon climbed out of the storm drain with mud on his knees and questions burning in his mind. The morning sun felt harsh after the underground darkness, and he squinted as he approached his supervisor's truck. Just seal it up and move on, Mike Rodriguez said without looking up from his clipboard. Probably some old utility access from the 50s. Cities full of forgotten infrastructure. But Brandon had seen Mike's face when he'd first radioed about the federal insignia. The man who'd worked city maintenance for 35 years had gone silent for a full 10 seconds, something that never happened. Mike, I've never seen markings like that. And the metal? It's not city standard. Look at this. Brandon held up his phone, showing the photo he'd snapped of the hatch. The Federal Eagle was unmistakable, embossed deep into the steel beneath layers of rust. Mike glanced at the screen and his jaw tightened. Not our problem, Carter. We fix pipes and clear drains. Whatever that is, it's above our pay grade. The dismissal felt forced, rehearsed. Brandon had worked with Mike long enough to know when his boss was hiding something. An hour later, Brandon sat in the fluorescent-lit records room in City Hall's basement, surrounded by filing cabinets that smelled of dust and old paper. The clerk, a thin woman named Janet, had been helpful at first, pulling blueprints from 1952 and 1954 without issue. But when Brandon asked specifically for 1953 construction records for the Maple Street area, her demeanor shifted. I'm sorry, but it looks like we're missing those files, she said, not meeting his eyes. Water damage from the flood in 78, most likely. Brandon frowned. The flood of 78 was the city's go-to excuse for missing records, but he'd never seen such a clean gap. Every other year was accounted for, the files meticulously organized and preserved. Only 1953 was completely absent. What about federal projects? Army Corps of Engineers? Maybe. Janet's face paled slightly. I wouldn't know about that. You'd have to contact them directly. As Brandon left City Hall, his phone buzzed with a text. From Mike. Don't go back to that site alone. Orders from the city engineer. The warning should have been reassuring. Safety first, after all. But the timing felt suspicious. Brandon had discovered the hatch less than 4 hours ago, and already the city engineer was involved. For a routine infrastructure issue, that evening Brandon returned to the storm drain with a small digital camera and a better flashlight. The hatch looked exactly the same, but now he noticed details he'd missed before. The rust patterns were uneven, heavier in some spots, as if the metal had been exposed to different conditions over the decades. More troubling were the dark stains around the edges, seeping into the concrete like old blood. He knelt and touched the stains with a gloved finger. The material was tacky, recent. Whatever was inside that sealed chamber was starting to leak out, and it had been doing so for some time. Brandon took dozens of photos from every angle, documenting the federal markings, the rust patterns, and those ominous stains. As he worked, a drop of the dark liquid landed on his glove. Under his flashlight beam, it had an oily, natural sheen that made his stomach turn. When he finally climbed out of the drain, Brandon found a black sedan parked at the end of Maple Street, its occupants nothing more than shadows behind tinted glass. Brandon's work boots echoed on the front porch of his small ranch house as he fumbled with his keys. The black sedan had followed him for 3 blocks before disappearing around a corner, and his nerves were still on edge. All he wanted was to wash the storm drain smell off his hands and forget about federal hatches and mysterious stains. Dad. Emma's voice called from the living room. Can you come here? I don't feel good. Brandon found his 13-year-old daughter, curled up on the couch, wrapped in her favorite blanket, the one with tiny horses printed on blue fabric. Her face was flushed, and when she pushed back her sleeves to show him her arms, Brandon's breath caught in his throat. Angry red welts covered her skin from wrist to elbow, raised and irregular like a severe allergic reaction. But Emma wasn't allergic to anything. They'd had her tested when she was 5 after a bee sting scare, and the results had been completely clear. When did this start, honey? Brandon sat on the edge of the couch, careful not to touch the affected areas. This morning, after I walked Bella, Emma's voice was small, scared. Bella was their neighbor's golden retriever, and Emma walked her every day after school for extra spending money. The route took her directly past the storm drain, where Brandon had found the hatch. Did Bella go into any puddles or anything unusual? Emma nodded. There was this weird puddle by the storm drain on Maple Street. It was kind of oily looking, and it smelled funny. Bella tried to drink from it, but I pulled her away. Brandon's stomach dropped. The storm drain, the leaking stains. His daughter had been exposed to whatever was seeping out of that sealed chamber. Emma, I need you to go take a shower right now, okay? Use the antibacterial soap, and don't touch those spots any more than you have to. As Emma headed to the bathroom, Brandon grabbed his phone and called Dr. Patricia Woods, Emma's pediatrician. The receptionist said they were booked solid, but when Brandon mentioned a possible chemical exposure, Dr. Woods agreed to see Emma that evening. While waiting for Emma to finish her shower, Brandon stepped onto his back porch and called his neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She answered on the second ring. Helen? It's Brandon. How's Tommy doing? Emma mentioned he was homesick today. Oh, Brandon, it's been awful. He woke up covered in these terrible red marks, and he's been throwing up all morning. I took him to urgent care, but they couldn't tell me what caused it. They just gave me some cream and told me to watch for fever. Brandon's blood ran cold. Tommy Chun lived 4 houses down from Emma, and he also had a paper route that took him past Maple Street every morning. Helen, has anyone else in the neighborhood been getting sick? Now that you mention it, yes. The Martinez family's little girl Sophia has the same rash. And I heard Mrs. Patterson talking about her grandson having stomach problems after visiting last weekend. Brandon, do you think there's something going around? Something was going around, all right? But it wasn't a virus or bacteria. It was whatever was leaking from that hatch, spreading through the stormwater system and contaminating the entire neighborhood. After Emma's appointment, where Dr. Woods prescribed antihistamines and corticosteroid cream but admitted she'd never seen anything quite like the rash, Brandon sat in his car in the parking lot and made a decision that would change everything. He pulled up the contact information for the local EPA office and dialed. Environmental Protection Agency. This is Michelle speaking. Hi, I need to report a possible chemical contamination in a residential area. I think something buried underground is leaking toxins into the stormwater system, and kids are getting sick. I can transfer you to our emergency response team. Can you hold for just a moment? As Brandon waited, he watched Emma through the car window. She was using hand sanitizer for the 3rd time. Her young face creased with worry. The rash had spread to her neck during the doctor's visit, and the antihistamines hadn't provided much relief. Sir, this is Agent Martinez with EPA Emergency Response. I understand you're reporting a possible contamination incident. Brandon took a deep breath and began to tell his story. When he mentioned the Federal Hatch from 1953, the line went quiet for several seconds. Sir, can you repeat the markings you saw on this hatch? Brandon described the Federal Eagle, the Do Not Open warning, and the date. Another long pause. We're going to need to send a team out to investigate. In the meantime, I need you to keep all residents away from the affected area. This is very important. No one should come into contact with any standing water or unusual substances in that location. As Brandon hung up, he realized he'd just opened a door that could never be closed. Brandon couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Emma's rash spreading across her skin like some medieval plague. At 2 a.m., he gave up pretending and slipped out of bed, careful not to wake his wife Sarah, who'd finally fallen asleep. After spending hours researching chemical burns on the internet, the EPA had promised to send a team, but not until Monday. 3 days away. 3 more days of children walking past that storm drain. 3 more days of whatever was down there continuing to leak into their neighborhood. Brandon grabbed his work flashlight, a crowbar, and his phone, then quietly left the house. Maple Street was eerily quiet at this hour, streetlights casting long shadows across empty sidewalks. The storm drain looked innocuous enough from street level, just another piece of urban infrastructure. But Brandon knew better now. He lowered himself into the drain tunnel, his flashlight beam immediately finding the hatch. In the darkness, the Federal Eagle seemed to watch him with metallic eyes. The stains around the edges had grown larger since yesterday, forming an almost perfect circle of dark, oily residue. Brandon set up his phone to record, then positioned his flashlight to illuminate the hatch clearly. This is Brandon Carter, October 15th, 2:30 a.m. I'm documenting what appears to be a federal installation from 1953 that's leaking unknown substances into the Maple Street storm drain system. He photographed the markings from every angle, then used his crowbar to scrape away some of the rust and debris. Beneath the corrosion, more text became visible. US Atomic Energy Commission, and below that, a radiation symbol that made Brandon's hands shake. Atomic Energy Commission Radiation 1953. Brandon's mind raced as he tried to process the implications. The federal government had buried something radioactive under his neighborhood 70 years ago, and now it was failing, leaking, poisoning the children who lived here. He was so focused on the hatch that he almost missed the sound. Footsteps, echoing through the tunnel system, coming from the main storm line that connected to the city's larger drainage network. Someone else was down here. Brandon killed his flashlight and pressed himself against the tunnel wall, his heart hammering. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the beam of a powerful flashlight that made his own equipment look like a toy. I know you're down there. Carter. The voice was calm, professional, with just a hint of a southern accent. City. Maintenance workers don't usually conduct midnight inspections. Brandon stayed silent, but his phone was still recording. He slipped it into his jacket pocket, hoping the microphone would pick up whatever happened next. My name is Agent Harrison, Department of Energy. I think we need to have a conversation. The man who emerged from the tunnel was tall and lean, wearing a dark suit that somehow remained pristine despite the underground environment. His flashlight beam found Brandon immediately, and there was no point in hiding. Mr. Carter, you've stumbled onto something that's been classified for 70 years. I need you to understand the seriousness of this situation. Kids are getting sick, Brandon said, finding his voice. My daughter, the neighbor's children, they're getting chemical burns from whatever's leaking out of that thing. Agent Harrison's expression didn't change. We're aware of the situation, and it's being handled through appropriate channels. Your involvement ends here. The hell it does. This is my neighborhood. These are my neighbors, and that's my daughter with radiation burns on her arms. Be very careful about the words you use, Mr. Carter. Terms like radiation can cause panic, and panic can be very dangerous for everyone involved. Brandon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the damp tunnel air. Are you threatening me? I'm trying to help you understand that some secrets are kept for good reasons. This installation has been stable for decades. What you're seeing is minor seepage from normal degradation, nothing more. Then why the midnight visit? Why the classified warnings? If it's so harmless, why not just tell people what's down there? Agent Harrison studied Brandon for a long moment, his flashlight beam steady. Because sometimes the cure is worse than the disease, Mr. Carter. Sometimes the panic and fear caused by knowledge does more damage than the original problem ever could. That's not your decision to make. Actually, it is. Under the Atomic Energy Act of 1954, information related to nuclear materials and installations is classified until declassified by appropriate federal authority. Sharing such information without authorization is a felony punishable by up to 10 years in federal prison. Brandon felt the phone in his pocket, still recording. So you're saying I can't even tell people to keep their kids away from a contaminated area? I'm saying you need to let the professionals handle this. The EPA team will conduct their assessment, proper procedures will be followed, and if any action is warranted, it will be taken through appropriate channels. And if those procedures take months, years, how many more kids get sick while you follow your protocols? Agent Harrison's silence was answer enough. I want you to go home, Mr. Carter. Spend time with your family. Let the system work the way it's supposed to work. As Brandon climbed out of the storm drain, Agent Harrison's final words followed him up. And Mr. Carter, I'd be very careful about what kinds of stories I tell people. Rumors can be dangerous things. The threat was clear, but so was Brandon's resolve. Whatever was buried under Maple Street, whatever the government had been hiding for 70 years, the truth was going to come out. Brandon waited until Sunday evening, when Agent Harrison would be long gone and the neighborhood was quiet. Sarah had taken Emma to her sister's house for the weekend. The rash was spreading despite the doctor's treatment, and they wanted to keep her away from whatever was causing it. This time, Brandon came prepared. He'd borrowed a proper Geiger counter from his brother-in-law Dave, who worked at the nuclear power plant 40 miles outside the city. He'd also brought a pry bar, work gloves, and a respirator mask he'd found in his garage. The storm drain felt different at night, more ominous somehow. Brandon's equipment cast harsh shadows on the tunnel walls as he approached the hatch. The radiation symbol seemed to glow in his flashlight beam, and the dark stains had spread even further since his encounter with Agent Harrison. Brandon turned on the Geiger counter, and immediately the device began clicking slowly at first. Then with increasing frequency as he moved closer to the hatch. By the time he was standing directly over it, the clicks were coming so fast they nearly formed a continuous sound. The readings on the digital display made his blood run cold, 500 millirems per hour, according to the safety card Dave had given him with the device. Anything over 5 millirems per hour warranted immediate evacuation from the area. Brandon set up his phone to record again, positioning it to capture both the Geiger counter readings and his work on the hatch. This is Brandon Carter, October 17th, 9:45 p.m. Radiation levels at the hatch location are reading 500 millirems per hour, 100 times higher than safe exposure limits. Using the pry bar, Brandon worked at the edges of the hatch. The metal was old and corroded, and several of the bolts had weakened over the decades. After 20 minutes of careful work, he felt the seal give way with a sharp crack that echoed through the tunnel. The smell hit him first, a metallic, acrid odor that made his eyes water even through the respirator mask. Then came the Geiger counter's response. The clicking accelerated to a frantic chatter, and the digital display spiked to over 1,000 millirems per hour. Brandon's hands shook as he lifted the hatch completely away, revealing a concrete chamber about 8 feet square and 12 feet deep. His flashlight beam illuminated a scene from his worst nightmares. Dozens of metal drums filled the space, stacked 3 high along the walls. Most were corroded beyond recognition, their surfaces eaten away by decades of moisture and chemical reactions. Several had ruptured completely, their contents forming a dark, oily lake at the bottom of the chamber. Each drum bore the same markings, a radiation symbol, US Atomic Energy Commission, and a date all from 1953, but it was the additional text that made Brandon's stomach lurch. High-level radioactive waste, plutonium oxide. Plutonium, the most toxic substance known to mankind. The government had buried dozens of drums of plutonium waste under his neighborhood and then simply forgotten about it. Let it sit there for 70 years until the containers failed and began leaking into the groundwater. Brandon's phone captured everything. The ruptured drums, the pooled radioactive sludge, the Geiger counter readings that were now approaching 1,500 milliamps per hour. This wasn't minor seepage from normal degradation. This was a catastrophic failure of a radioactive waste disposal site that should never have existed in the first place. As he documented the chamber, Brandon noticed something else that made his heart race. The concrete walls showed clear signs of recent water damage, not from decades of slow seepage, but from fresh infiltration. The city's storm drain system was directly connected to this chamber, and every time it rained, contaminated water was flowing directly into the neighborhood's drainage network, the same drainage network that carried rainwater to the retention pond where children fed ducks, the same system that overflowed during heavy rains, flooding yards and basements throughout the area. The same network that had been slowly poisoning his community for who knew how long. Brandon was so absorbed in his documentation that he almost missed the sound of vehicles pulling up above. Car doors slammed, and he heard multiple sets of footsteps moving toward the storm drain entrance. Federal agents. Come out immediately. The voice echoed down the tunnel with unmistakable authority. Brandon grabbed his phone and the Geiger counter, then looked one last time at the chamber full of leaking plutonium drums. Agent Harrison had been right about one thing: sometimes knowledge was dangerous. But not for the reasons the government thought. The truth was dangerous to their decades-long cover-up. The truth was dangerous to the officials who had authorized burying nuclear waste under a residential neighborhood. The truth was dangerous to everyone who had known about this and chosen to stay silent while children got sick. As Brandon climbed toward the surface and the federal agents waiting above, he smiled grimly. The truth was indeed dangerous, but now it belonged to him. The federal agents confiscated Brandon's Geiger counter and searched him thoroughly, but they missed the most important thing. His phone's automatic cloud backup had already uploaded every photo and video to his personal account. By the time they released him with stern warnings about national security and federal prosecution, the evidence was safely stored beyond their reach. Brandon spent the next morning in his home office, diving deep into declassified government documents online. What he found made his blood boil with rage at the scope of the deception. Operation Plowshare had been real, but it wasn't what the public had been told. Officially, it was a peaceful nuclear program designed to use atomic energy for civilian construction projects, digging canals, creating harbors, that sort of thing. But the declassified files told a different story. In 1953, the Atomic Energy Commission had initiated a covert program to dispose of high-level nuclear waste in urban areas across the country. The theory was that burying small quantities of radioactive material in populated areas would dilute the contamination and make it less detectable than concentrated storage in remote locations. 12 cities had been selected for the pilot program. Brandon's hometown was number 7 on the list. The original documents, stamped with official seals and signed by officials whose names Brandon recognized from history books, made for chilling reading. They detailed the selection criteria: neighborhoods with low property values, minimal political influence, and demographics considered expendable by the planners. Maple Street had checked all the boxes. Working-class families, mostly immigrants and minorities, with little political power and few resources to fight back even if they discovered the truth. The perfect location for an experiment that the planners knew was fundamentally unethical. But the most damning evidence was in the maintenance reports. Every 5 years since 1958, government inspectors had visited the site and documented the gradual failure of the containment drums. The reports showed steadily increasing radiation levels, visible corrosion of the containers, and clear evidence of groundwater contamination. Every single report had concluded with the same recommendation: immediate cleanup and proper disposal of the waste materials. Every single report had been ignored. The most recent inspection, dated just 6 months ago, showed radiation levels nearly identical to what Brandon had measured with Dave's Geiger counter. The inspector had noted catastrophic containment failure, an immediate threat to public health, yet no action had been taken. They had known. For decades they had known that children were being slowly poisoned, that families were being exposed to deadly radiation, that the entire neighborhood was sitting on a nuclear time bomb, and they had chosen to do nothing because cleanup would be expensive, and admission of the program would be politically devastating. Brandon printed every document he could find, creating a paper trail that couldn't be deleted or hacked. As he worked, his phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Emma's rash is getting worse, taking her to the emergency room. The hospital was chaos. Brandon found Sarah in the pediatric ward where Emma lay in a bed surrounded by machines that beeped and whirred ominously. Her rash had spread to cover most of her torso, and the doctors were running tests to determine what kind of toxin had caused such severe skin damage. Mr. Carter. Dr. Patricia Woods approached with a clipboard and a concerned expression. I need to ask you some questions about Emma's possible exposure to chemicals or other hazardous materials. Brandon looked at his daughter, her young face pale against the white hospital sheets, and made a decision that would put his family in the crosshairs of one of the most powerful cover-ups in American history. Doctor, I need to tell you something that's going to sound unbelievable. But first, I need you to promise me that you'll document everything I'm about to say in Emma's medical records. Dr. Woods nodded, pen ready. 6 days ago, I discovered a cache of plutonium waste buried under our neighborhood. It's been leaking into the stormwater system for years, possibly decades. Emma was exposed when she walked past contaminated puddles near the disposal site. Dr. Woods's pen stopped moving. Mr. Carter, did you say plutonium? High-level radioactive waste from a 1953 government disposal program? I have documentation, photos, radiation readings. This isn't just affecting Emma. There are at least a dozen other children in the area with similar symptoms. The doctor's face went white as the implications hit her. Mr. Carter, if what you're telling me is true, we're looking at radiation poisoning on a massive scale. I need to contact the CDC immediately, and I need to contact every news outlet in the country because the people responsible for this have been covering it up for 70 years. And they're not going to stop unless we force them to. Brandon left the hospital with a new understanding of how deep the government's reach could extend. Dr. Woods had agreed to contact the CDC, but when she tried to make the call from her office phone, the line went dead. Her cell phone showed no signal. Despite being in the middle of the city with normally excellent coverage, the hospital's internet connection mysteriously failed, just as she attempted to access the CDC's emergency reporting portal. Even the fax machine, ancient technology that nobody bothered to monitor, somehow jammed when she tried to send Emma's medical records to the state health department. I have never seen anything like this, Dr. Woods whispered to Brandon as they stood in the hospital corridor. It's like someone is actively blocking all our communications. Brandon wasn't surprised. If the government had the resources to monitor and contain a nuclear waste site for 70 years, they certainly had the capability to interfere with phone calls and internet connections. When Brandon arrived home, the signs of surveillance were subtle but unmistakable. His mail had been rifled through, the stack was neat, but the envelopes were in the wrong order. His home office showed similar signs, papers slightly displaced, his computer's browser history mysteriously cleared, and file folders that weren't quite where he'd left them. Most disturbing was his kitchen window. Brandon always left it cracked open for ventilation, but now it was closed and locked. Someone had been inside his house, searching through his belongings, while his family was at the hospital. That evening, Brandon walked to his neighbor Mrs. Chen's house to check on Tommy and found her in her front yard, watering plants that clearly didn't need watering. She was agitated, nervous, glancing repeatedly at a dark sedan parked across the street. Brandon, thank God you're here. There have been men watching our house all day. They knocked on the door around noon and showed me some kind of federal identification, asking questions about Tommy's illness. What kind of questions? Whether he'd been playing near storm drains, whether we'd noticed any unusual odors or discoloration in standing water, whether we'd spoken to anyone else about his symptoms. They seemed particularly interested in whether we'd talked to you. Brandon felt his stomach clench. What did you tell them? The truth? That Tommy got sick right after Emma did, and that we've been comparing notes about their symptoms. But Brandon, they weren't taking notes to help our children. They were trying to figure out how much we knew and who we'd told. As if summoned by their conversation, two men in dark suits emerged from the sedan and walked toward them. Brandon recognized one as Agent Harrison from his underground encounter. Mr. Carter, Mrs. Chen. Beautiful evening, isn't it? Agent Harrison's tone was friendly, but his eyes were cold. Mrs. Chen, I believe my colleague spoke with you earlier about your son's condition. Mrs. Chen nodded nervously. Is there news about what's making the children sick? We're still investigating, but I can assure you that there's no immediate danger to the community. Sometimes these kinds of skin conditions can be caused by seasonal allergies or exposure to common household chemicals. Plutonium isn't a common household chemical, Brandon said quietly. Agent Harrison's smile didn't waver, but his companion's hand moved slightly toward his jacket. Mr. Carter, we've discussed the importance of not spreading unsubstantiated rumors. False information can cause unnecessary panic, and accurate information can save lives. Can it? Or does it simply create fear and chaos that accomplishes nothing positive? Agent Harrison stepped closer. Consider your daughter's situation, Mr. Carter. She's receiving excellent medical care at the hospital. Her doctors are focused on treatment, not on wild theories about government conspiracies. Which approach do you think is more likely to help her recover? The threat was subtle but clear. Cooperate, or Emma's medical care might become less excellent. Mrs. Chen looked confused, glancing between Brandon and Agent Harrison. I don't understand. What does the government have to do with our children's illness? Nothing at all, Mrs. Chen. Mr. Carter has developed some unusual theories about the cause of these skin conditions, but there's no evidence to support his concerns. We're simply trying to prevent the spread of misinformation that might interfere with proper medical treatment. Brandon realized he was watching a masterclass in manipulation. Agent Harrison was positioning him as the problem, a delusional conspiracy theorist whose wild claims were actually harmful to the children he was trying to help. After the agents left, Mrs. Chen turned to Brandon with worry in her eyes. "Brandon, what's really going on? Those men seem to know more about our children's illness than they were saying." Brandon looked at his neighbor, a hard-working single mother who deserved to know that her son had been poisoned by his own government. But Agent Harrison's message had been clear: involve more people, and the consequences would escalate. "Helen, I need you to do something for me. Take Tommy to see a specialist, someone outside the area, maybe at the university hospital. Get a second opinion on his condition, and make sure they document everything thoroughly." "Why? What aren't you telling me?" Brandon glanced at the sedan, which had moved but hadn't left the neighborhood. The watchers were still there, still listening, still waiting. "Because I think our children deserve doctors who aren't afraid to ask difficult questions." That night, Brandon lay awake listening to sounds that might have been normal settling of the house, or might have been something else entirely. Every car that drove past seemed to slow down near his driveway. Every phone call that went to voicemail made him wonder if the lines were being monitored. But Brandon had spent 22 years working for the city, solving problems that other people preferred to ignore. He wasn't going to stop now, even if the problem was bigger and more dangerous than anything he'd ever faced. The watchers could watch. The truth was still the truth. Brandon knew he couldn't fight this battle alone. The federal agents had made it clear that direct confrontation would only put his family in greater danger. He needed Alley's people with expertise and resources who could help expose the truth, without becoming targets themselves. Dr. Sarah Martinez had been studying environmental health in the region for 8 years. Ever since completing her PhD in environmental toxicology at the State University, Brandon found her contact information through the university's website and called from a payphone outside a gas station 15 miles from his house. "Dr. Martinez, my name is Brandon Carter. I need to speak with you about radiation exposure in the Maple Street area. I believe you've been tracking unusual cancer rates in that neighborhood." There was a long pause before Dr. Martinez responded. "Mr. Carter, can you tell me how you obtained my contact information and why you think I might be interested in this particular area? Your published research mentions elevated rates of childhood leukemia and thyroid cancer in several neighborhoods throughout the city. Maple Street was in your dataset, and the rates there are 3 times higher than the regional average." Another pause. "Mr. Carter, I think we need to meet in person. Are you available this evening?" They arranged to meet at a small coffee shop in the University District. Far from Brandon's neighborhood and the watchful eyes of Agent Harrison's team, Dr. Martinez was younger than Brandon had expected, probably in her early 30s, with dark hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and intense brown eyes that seemed to take in everything. "Before we discuss anything else," she said as they settled into a corner booth, "I need you to understand that I've been investigating environmental health issues in this city for years, and I've encountered significant resistance from both government agencies and private interests." "What kind of resistance?" "Funding cuts, access restrictions, bureaucratic delays that mysteriously resolve when I change my research focus away from certain areas." Dr. Martinez leaned forward, lowering her voice. "Mr. Carter, 3 months ago I submitted a grant application to study groundwater contamination in the Maple Street neighborhood. The application was rejected within a week, the fastest rejection I've ever received." Brandon felt a spark of hope. Dr. Martinez wasn't just an academic researcher. She was someone who had already noticed the patterns and encountered the same stonewalling he was experiencing. "Dr. Martinez, what I'm about to tell you is going to sound impossible, but I have documentation, photographs, and radiation readings to support everything I'm saying." Over the next hour, Brandon shared his story: the discovery of the hatch, the confrontation with Agent Harrison, the chamber full of leaking plutonium drums, and the decades-long cover-up revealed in declassified documents. Dr. Martinez listened without interruption, taking notes on a small pad. When Brandon finished, Dr. Martinez sat back in her chair, her expression grave. "Mr. Carter, your story explains something that's been bothering me for years. The cancer rates in the Maple Street area aren't just elevated, they're elevated in a very specific pattern that's consistent with long-term low-level radiation exposure." She pulled out her phone and showed Brandon a map marked with colored dots. Each dot represents a cancer case in the past 20 years. Red is leukemia, blue is thyroid cancer, green is lung cancer. "Look at the distribution." The map showed a clear cluster centered on Maple Street, with the highest concentration of cases in the exact area where Brandon had discovered the hatch. The pattern was too precise to be coincidental. "I've been trying to get soil and water samples from that area for months, but every request has been denied. The city claims it's a safety issue due to old infrastructure, but they won't specify what kind of safety hazard they're concerned about, because they know exactly what's down there," Brandon said. "They've known for decades. Dr. Martinez nodded grimly. Mr. Carter, if what you've discovered is accurate, we're looking at one of the most significant environmental crimes in American history, the deliberate disposal of high-level nuclear waste in a residential area, followed by a systematic cover-up that allowed the contamination to continue for 70 years. Can you help me expose this? I have the evidence, but I need someone with scientific credentials to verify the contamination and its health effects. I can do more than that. I have contacts at the EPA, the CDC, and several environmental organizations that specialize in government accountability. But Mr. Carter, you need to understand that once we start this process, there's no going back. The people responsible for this cover-up have billions of dollars and 70 years of practice at keeping secrets. Brandon thought about Emma in her hospital bed, about Tommy Chun's spreading rash, about all the families who had lost loved ones to cancers that could have been prevented if the truth had been told decades ago. Dr. Martinez, they've been poisoning children for 70 years. Whatever the cost, whatever the risk, that has to stop. Dr. Martinez closed her notebook and extended her hand. Then we're going to stop it. But we're going to need more help than just the two of us. What kind of help? The kind of help that comes from people who've been fighting this fight longer than we have. People who know how to take on the federal government and win. As they left the coffee shop, Brandon noticed a familiar black sedan pulling into the parking lot. Agent Harrison's surveillance team had found them. But for the first time since discovering the hatch, Brandon wasn't afraid. He wasn't alone anymore. And the truth was about to get much more dangerous for the people who had been hiding it. Dr. Martinez's contacts moved faster than Brandon had dared to hope. Within 48 hours of their coffee shop meeting, she had connected him with a network of environmental activists, investigative journalists, and former government employees who specialized in exposing nuclear contamination cover-ups. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source, Dr. Robert Kim, a former EPA inspector who had been forced into early retirement after repeatedly trying to blow the whistle on government agencies that ignored environmental hazards. Mr. Carter, Dr. Kim said over an encrypted video call, Dr. Martinez shared your evidence with me, and I need you to know that Maple Street isn't an isolated case. Over the past 30 years, I've documented at least 6 similar sites across the country, all from the same 1953 disposal program, all still leaking, all still being covered up. Brandon felt sick. 6 sites. How many people are we talking about? Conservative estimate. 50,000 people have been exposed to elevated radiation levels over the decades. The actual health impact is impossible to calculate because the government has systematically suppressed medical research in these areas. Dr. Kim's revelation opened floodgates of information. Within hours, Brandon was connected to families from Ohio, Nevada, and Tennessee who had fought similar battles against federal agencies that denied the existence of contamination sites in their neighborhoods. Each case followed the same pattern. Initial discovery by a civilian, immediate government intervention and denial, years of legal battles that ended in sealed settlements and non-disclosure agreements. But Brandon's case was different in one crucial way. He had documented evidence from inside the actual disposal site. The photos you took are unprecedented, explained Janet Williams, an investigative journalist who specialized in government secrecy. In every other case, the feds managed to secure the site before anyone could document what was actually buried. There, your pictures of those plutonium drums are smoking gun evidence of the entire program. The network moved quickly to protect Brandon's evidence. Copies were distributed to journalists, environmental groups, and lawyers across the country. The cloud storage system Brandon had used automatically backed up his files to servers in 3 different countries, making it impossible for the government to suppress all the evidence simultaneously. Meanwhile, Dr. Martinez had been conducting her own investigation with help from sympathetic EPA employees who were willing to share information off the record. What they found confirmed Brandon's worst fears and revealed new horrors he hadn't imagined. Brandon, the monitoring data goes back to 1978, Dr. Martinez said during a secure phone call. EPA has been testing soil, water, and air quality around the Maple Street site for 47 years. Every single report shows dangerous levels of contamination, and every single report has been classified and buried. What about the health data? That's where it gets really ugly. CDC has been tracking cancer rates in the area since 1965. They know exactly how many people have died from radiation-induced cancers, how many children have developed leukemia, how many families have been destroyed by preventable diseases. Brandon gripped the phone tighter. How many? The Maple Street area alone. Over the past 60 years, we're looking at approximately 340 excess cancer cases, including 89 children. The government has statistical proof that their disposal program has killed hundreds of people, and they've chosen to keep that information secret rather than admit what they did. The numbers hit Brandon like a physical blow. 340 families destroyed, 89 children who died from radiation poisoning while the government that killed them pretended that contamination didn't exist. But the most damning revelation came from a source that Dr. Martinez refused to identify over the phone. Someone inside the current administration who had access to recent briefing documents about the Maple Street site. Brandon, they know the site is failing catastrophically. The internal reports predict that within 2 years, radiation levels in the groundwater will exceed safe limits throughout a 5-mile radius. We're not just talking about your immediate neighborhood anymore. We're talking about contamination that could affect the entire eastern half of the city. How many people? 250,000 residents, including 12 schools and 3 hospitals. The government has known this was coming for years, and their plan is to let it happen and then blame it on an unexpected failure of a previously unknown Cold War installation. Brandon felt rage building in his chest like a physical pressure. The scope of the conspiracy was almost incomprehensible. Not just the original disposal program, not just the decades-long cover-up, but an active plan to allow a catastrophic release of radiation rather than admit the truth about what they had done. Dr. Martinez, we need to go public with this immediately. Not next week, not after we gather more evidence. Now, I agree, but we need to be smart about how we do it. The moment this story breaks, they're going to come after all of us with everything they have. Character assassination, legal harassment, maybe worse. They've already poisoned my daughter and 340 other people in my neighborhood. How much worse can it get? Dr. Martinez was quiet for a long moment. Brandon, these are people who buried plutonium under a residential area and then spent 70 years covering it up. They've demonstrated pretty clearly that there's no line they won't cross. That evening, as Brandon sat by Emma's hospital bed, watching her sleep, he made the decision that would either expose one of the largest environmental crimes in American history or destroy his family in the process. He was going to tell the world what the government had buried under Maple Street. No matter what it cost him, the truth was bigger than his fear. Bigger than Agent Harrison's threats. Bigger than the career-ending consequences Dr. Martinez had warned him about. 340 people were dead because of government lies. It was time to stop counting the cost and start counting the lives that could still be saved. 3 days after Brandon's conversation with Dr. Martinez, Emma's condition took a dramatic turn for the worse. The rash that had started on her arms now covered most of her body. Angry red welts that wept clear fluid and refused to heal despite increasingly aggressive medical treatment. Her fever spiked to 103 degrees. And she began experiencing severe nausea that kept her from eating. Dr. Woods called Brandon at 2 a.m. with news that made his blood run cold. Mr. Carter, I need you to come to the hospital immediately. Emma's blood work shows signs of severe bone marrow suppression. Her white blood cell count has dropped to dangerous levels. Brandon knew what that meant. Bone marrow suppression was a classic symptom of acute radiation poisoning. His 13-year-old daughter wasn't just suffering from skin irritation anymore. The plutonium contamination was attacking her body's ability to fight infection and produce healthy blood cells. When Brandon arrived at the hospital, he found Sarah collapsed in a chair beside Emma's bed, her face streaked with tears. Emma looked smaller somehow, pale and fragile against the white sheets, with 4 lines running into both arms. They're talking about transferring her to the cancer center, Sarah whispered. They think she might need a bone marrow transplant. The words hit Brandon like a physical blow. A bone marrow transplant for a child who had been perfectly healthy 2 weeks ago, before walking past a puddle contaminated with government nuclear waste. As Brandon sat by Emma's bedside, his phone buzzed with increasingly urgent messages from neighbors throughout the area. Tommy Chen had been admitted to the same hospital with similar symptoms. The Martinez family's daughter Sophia was in the pediatric ICU at another facility across town. Mrs. Patterson's grandson, who had only visited for a weekend, was being treated for severe anemia at a children's hospital 3 hours away. The pattern was undeniable, and it was accelerating. Whatever was leaking from the buried plutonium drums wasn't just causing skin problems anymore. Children throughout the neighborhood were developing symptoms consistent with acute radiation exposure, and the medical community was finally starting to connect the dots. Dr. Woods pulled Brandon aside during one of her rounds. Mr. Carter, I've been in contact with colleagues at other hospitals. We're seeing a cluster of radiation-related illnesses that's unprecedented in civilian medicine. I've reported this to the CDC, but their response has been ... unusual. What? Do you mean, unusual? They acknowledged my report but classified it immediately under some kind of national security protocol. I was told that all further communication about these cases needs to go through a Department of Energy liaison. Brandon felt his stomach drop. Agent Harrison's people were now controlling the medical response to the contamination, ensuring that doctors couldn't share information or coordinate treatment without government oversight. Dr. Woods, I need to ask you something, and I need you to give me an honest answer. If Emma doesn't get proper treatment, if this keeps getting worse, what are we looking at? The doctor was quiet for a long moment, choosing her words carefully. Mr. Carter, radiation poisoning in children is one of the most aggressive forms of toxic exposure we see. If the source of contamination isn't eliminated, and if she doesn't receive specialized treatment soon, We could be looking at permanent immune system damage, increased cancer risk, and potentially, she didn't finish the sentence. But she didn't need to. Brandon looked through the window at Emma, who was sleeping fitfully with fever-flushed cheeks, and made a decision that would change everything. He pulled out his phone and opened the contact. For Janet Williams, the investigative journalist Dr. Martinez had introduced him to. Janet, it's Brandon Carter. I'm ready to go public with everything. My daughter is dying, and I'm not going to let them cover this up while children suffer. Brandon, are you sure? Once we release this story, there's no taking it back. Brandon watched a nurse adjust Emma's noted the worried expression on her face as she checked the monitors showing his daughter's dangerously low blood counts. I'm sure the truth can't be more dangerous than the lies that are killing our kids. As Brandon ended the call, he realized he had just declared war on the most powerful government in the world. But looking at Emma's pale face, he knew he had no choice. Some fights were worth everything. The call came at 6 a.m., just as Brandon was leaving the hospital after another sleepless night by Emma's bedside. The voice was elderly, gravelly, and careful. Mr. Carter, this is Thomas Fletcher. I believe you've been asking questions about a certain federal installation from 1953. Brandon stepped into an empty hospital corridor, suddenly alert. Who is this? Someone who's been waiting 30 years to tell the truth about what happened under Maple Street. I worked for the Environmental Protection Agency. From 1965 to 1995, I was one of the inspectors who documented the contamination at your site. Brandon's heart began to race. A government insider willing to talk. Someone with first-hand knowledge. Of the cover-up. Double quotes, Mr. Fletcher. Where can we meet? My house. 412 Oak Ridge Drive. Come alone, and make sure you're not being followed. What I have to show you could send people to prison for the rest of their lives. An hour later, Brandon stood on the porch of a modest ranch house in a quiet suburb 20 miles from Maple Street. Thomas Fletcher was in his 70s, tall and thin with white hair and sharp blue eyes that missed nothing. His living room was a monument to bureaucratic persistence. Filing cabinets lined every wall, and bankers' boxes filled with documents were stacked from floor to ceiling. 30 years, Fletcher said as he poured coffee with shaking hands. 30 years, I've been collecting evidence, documenting every lie they told, every report they buried, every family they sacrificed to keep this secret. He led Brandon to a massive desk covered with manila folders, each one labeled with dates and locations. Operation Plowshare wasn't just about your neighborhood, Mr. Carter. It was a nationwide program to dispose of nuclear waste in populated areas, 12 cities, 43 disposal sites, and a cover-up that reaches all the way to the highest levels of government. Fletcher opened the first folder, revealing photographs that made Brandon's stomach turn. Images of corroded drums leaking radioactive sludge, Geiger counter readings that spiked off the charts, and medical reports documenting radiation sickness in children. This is from the Ohio site, discovered in 1987. 17 children developed leukemia before they managed to seal it off from public access. Fletcher turned to another folder. Nevada, 1994. An entire elementary school was built on top of a disposal site. 60 cases of thyroid cancer in children under the age of 12. Brandon stared at the evidence, feeling sick. How many people know about this? More than you'd think, fewer than there should be. Every administration since Eisenhower has been briefed on the program. Everyone has chosen to continue the cover-up rather than face the political and financial consequences of admission. Fletcher pulled out a thick folder labeled Maple Street, 1978 to 2023, and spread its contents across the desk. The documents painted a picture of systematic deception that spanned decades. Your site was inspected every 5 years. Like clockwork, every report documented increasing contamination, failing containment, and imminent threat to public health. Every report was classified and ignored. Brandon studied the inspection reports, noting the steady escalation in radiation readings over the decades. The most recent report, dated 6 months ago, included photographs of the same corroded drums he'd seen in the underground chamber. Mr. Fletcher, why are you willing to talk now? After 30 years of keeping quiet, the old man's eyes hardened. Because I'm 76 years old. I have terminal cancer that's probably related to my years of exposure to these sites, and I'm tired of watching children die for the sake of political convenience. Fletcher moved to another filing cabinet and withdrew a manila envelope marked Classified, Department of Energy. This came into my possession through channels I can't discuss. It's a briefing document prepared for the current administration about the Maple Street site. Brandon opened the envelope and found himself looking at a memo dated just 3 weeks ago. The subject line made his blood run cold. Controlled Disclosure Strategy, Maple Street Nuclear Waste Site. The memo outlined a plan to allow the contamination to spread until it affected a large enough population to justify declaring a public health emergency. The government would then discover the previously unknown disposal site, express shock and regret, and implement a cleanup program that would cost billions of dollars, but allow officials to appear responsive and competent. They're planning to let it get worse, Brandon said, his voice barely a whisper. They're going to let more children get sick so they can control the narrative when they finally admit what they did. The memo estimates that acceptable losses over the next 2 years would be approximately 200 additional cancer cases, including 60 children. They consider this an acceptable trade-off for maintaining control of the disclosure timeline. Brandon thought about Emma in her hospital bed, about Tommy, Chen, and Sofia Martinez, about all the families who didn't know their children were being slowly poisoned by their own government. Mr. Fletcher, I need copies of everything. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence you have. The old man smiled for the first time since Brandon had arrived. I was hoping you'd say that. I've been preparing for this conversation for 30 years. Fletcher moved to a large safe hidden behind one of the filing cabinets. Inside were dozens of thumb drives, each one labeled with dates and locations. Every document, every photograph, every piece of evidence from 4 contamination sites across the country. It's all here, and it's all verified. This is enough evidence to bring down everyone who's been involved in this cover-up, from local officials all the way up to cabinet-level positions. As Brandon left Fletcher's house with a briefcase full of evidence that could topple governments, he realized that the old EPA inspector had just handed him the most dangerous information in America. The truth about Operation Plowshare wasn't just about Maple Street. It was about a conspiracy so vast and so deadly that exposing it would shake the foundations of public trust in government. But as Brandon thought about Emma's fever-flushed face, he knew he didn't have a choice. The truth had to come out. No matter who it destroyed, Dr. Martinez's laboratory had been transformed into a war room. Environmental test results covered every available surface. Computers ran analysis programs around the clock, and a team of volunteer researchers worked in shifts to process the overwhelming amount of evidence Thomas Fletcher had provided. The results were even worse than Brandon had feared. The contamination has spread far beyond what we initially thought, Dr. Martinez explained as she pointed to a large map of the city marked with color-coded zones. Groundwater testing shows elevated radiation levels extending in a 5-mile radius from the original disposal site. Brandon studied the map, noting that the contamination zone included 3 elementary schools, a daycare center, and 2 hospitals. How many people are we talking about? Direct exposure area, approximately 8,000 residents. Extended contamination zone, nearly 50,000. And Brandon, the levels are increasing exponentially. Dr. Martinez pulled up a graph on her computer showing radiation readings over the past 6 months. The trend line was steep and accelerating. Based on these measurements, we estimate that within 18 months, radiation levels in the groundwater will exceed federal safety limits by a factor of 10. The stormwater system, which carries contaminated runoff throughout the eastern half of the city, will become essentially radioactive. The scope of the impending disaster was staggering. Not just Brandon's neighborhood, but a significant portion of the entire metropolitan area would become uninhabitable without immediate intervention. What about the health impacts? Dr. Martinez's expression grew grave. Based on epidemiological models and data from similar contamination events, we're looking at potentially thousands of cancer cases over the next 20 years. The children who are already showing symptoms, like Emma, are just the beginning. Brandon felt a surge of desperate urgency. How long do we have? To prevent catastrophic contamination spread? Maybe 6 months. To save the children who are already sick? Much less. As if summoned by their conversation, Dr. Martinez's phone rang. It was Dr. Woods from the hospital. Sarah, it's Patricia. I'm calling about the children with radiation exposure symptoms. We've had some developments that I think you need to know about. Dr. Martinez put the call on speaker. What kind of developments? We now have 14 children admitted to hospitals throughout the metro area with symptoms consistent with acute radiation poisoning. Blood work shows bone marrow suppression, immune system dysfunction, and cellular damage patterns that are textbook radiation exposure cases. Brandon gripped the edge of the table. 14 children, and Emma was just one of them. But here's what's really concerning, Dr. Woods continued. I've been trying to coordinate treatment protocols with other physicians, but I keep running into bureaucratic roadblocks. The CDC has classified all medical information related to these cases, and the Department of Energy has assigned liaisons to each hospital treating affected children. They're controlling the medical response. Dr. Martinez said grimly, it's worse than that. The liaisons are discouraging aggressive treatment, claiming that the children's symptoms are more likely related to seasonal allergies or exposure to common household chemicals. They're literally preventing us from treating radiation poisoning, because it would confirm the existence of a contamination source. Brandon felt rage building in his chest. Not only had the government buried nuclear waste under his neighborhood and covered it up for 70 years, they were now actively interfering with medical treatment for the children they had poisoned. Dr. Woods, what do the children need? What kind of treatment would help them? Immediate chelation therapy to remove radioactive particles from their systems, bone marrow support, specialized immune system treatment. But these protocols require acknowledging that we're dealing with radiation exposure, which the government liaisons refuse to allow. After ending the call, Brandon and Dr. Martinez sat in stunned silence. The government wasn't just covering up the contamination anymore. They were willing to let children die to maintain their secret. We need to go public immediately, Brandon said. Tonight, before more kids get sick, before the contamination spreads further. Dr. Martinez nodded. I've been working with Janet Williams and her network. They're ready to coordinate a simultaneous release across multiple media outlets, making it impossible for the government to suppress the story. What do we need to do? Final verification of the test results, confirmation from Thomas Fletcher's sources, and documentation that clearly links the government cover-up to the current medical crisis. They worked through the night, preparing a comprehensive report that combined Brandon's photographic evidence, Fletcher's declassified documents, Dr. Martinez's environmental testing, and medical records from the affected children. The result was a devastating indictment of 70 years of government deception and negligence. At dawn, Dr. Martinez made the call that would change everything. Janet, it's Sarah. We're ready to release the story. Send the package to every contact you have, every news outlet, every environmental organization. Make sure it goes out simultaneously so they can't stop it. As they waited for Janet's confirmation, Brandon received a text message from Sarah. Emma's fever is spiking again. Doctors are talking about putting her on life support. Brandon stared at the message, feeling the weight of time running out. His daughter was dying from radiation poisoning while bureaucrats and politicians calculated the political cost of admitting their mistakes. Dr. Martinez, how long before the story goes public? Janet says 6 hours. Every major network, newspaper, and online outlet will have the complete evidence package by 2 p.m. Brandon looked at his watch. It was 8 a.m. on a Tuesday morning that would be remembered as the day the American people learned their government had been secretly poisoning them for 70 years. In 6 hours, the cover-up would be over. The question was whether it would be soon enough to save Emma and the other children who were paying the price for decades of government lies. As Brandon drove back to the hospital, he realized that exposing the truth was only the beginning. Now came the much harder task of forcing the government to actually fix the problem they had created and covered up for 7 decades. The race against time wasn't over. It was just getting started. Brandon arrived home from the hospital to find Agent Harrison sitting in his living room like he owned the place. The federal agent looked completely relaxed, flipping through a photo album that had been sitting on Brandon's coffee table. Lovely family photos, Mr. Carter. Emma's school pictures are particularly charming. Such a bright smile for a sick little girl. The threat in Harrison's words was unmistakable. Brandon's hands clenched into fists, but he forced himself to remain calm. How did you get into my house? I think the better question is how we can help each other. Mr. Carter, you have something we need, and we have something you need. Harrison closed the photo album and set it carefully back on the table. We know about your meeting with Dr. Martinez, your contact with Thomas Fletcher, and your plan to release information to the media. We also know that Emma's condition has deteriorated significantly in the past 48 hours. Brandon felt ice in his veins. Are you threatening my daughter? Quite the opposite. I'm here to help her. Harrison reached into his briefcase and withdrew a small vial filled with clear liquid. This is an experimental chelation compound developed specifically for plutonium exposure. It's not available through normal medical channels, but it's shown remarkable success in treating acute radiation poisoning in children. Brandon stared at the vial. What do you want? All copies of the evidence you've gathered, all documents provided by Mr. Fletcher, all test results from Dr. Martinez's laboratory, complete cooperation in containing this situation before it causes unnecessary panic. And if I refuse? Harrison's smile was cold. Then Emma continues to receive standard medical care through normal channels. Given the progression of her symptoms, I'd estimate she has perhaps 2 weeks before her condition becomes irreversible. The agent stood and walked to the window, looking out at the quiet suburban street. Mr. Carter, you need to understand something. This situation is much bigger than one neighborhood, much bigger than a few sick children. National security implications, international treaties, economic stability. The ramifications of public disclosure would be catastrophic. More catastrophic than children dying from radiation poisoning? Potentially, yes. Panic-induced evacuations from similar sites across the country could displace hundreds of thousands of people. Legal liabilities could bankrupt the federal government. International confidence in American nuclear security could collapse, destabilizing global markets. Harrison turned back to Brandon, his expression serious. We're not the villains here, Mr. Carter. We're trying to manage an impossible situation, with the least possible harm to the greatest number of people. Brandon thought about Emma in her hospital bed, about the 14 other children suffering from radiation exposure, about the thousands of families who didn't know they were living on contaminated land. By letting children die, by preventing mass hysteria that could cause far more deaths than the original problem. Controlled cleanup, gradual relocation, proper medical treatment for affected individuals. All of this can happen without public disclosure if you're willing to work with us. Harrison held out the vial again. This treatment could save Emma's life. Mr. Carter, All we ask in return is your cooperation in handling this situation responsibly. Brandon stared at the clear liquid that could save his daughter, weighing it against the evidence that could save thousands of other children. The choice Harrison was offering wasn't really a choice at all. It was extortion disguised as negotiation. How do I know that vial contains what you say it does? You don't. But given Emma's current prognosis, can you afford not to trust us? The agent's phone buzzed, and he glanced at it with a frown. Mr. Carter, I'm afraid our timeline has just accelerated. It appears that your journalist friends are planning to release their story earlier than anticipated. Brandon felt his stomach drop. Had Janet moved up the release schedule, in approximately 2 hours, multiple news outlets will begin reporting on alleged nuclear contamination in residential areas. This is deeply unfortunate, as it forces us to implement emergency protocols that could have been avoided through cooperation. Harrison returned the vial to his briefcase and snapped it shut. Mr. Carter, you now have a choice to make, and you have about 90 minutes to make it. Cooperate with our efforts to manage this situation responsibly, and Emma receives immediate treatment. Continue with your plan to create public panic, and will be forced to discredit your evidence through appropriate channels. What does that mean? Character assassination, evidence tampering accusations, questions about your mental stability and motivations. By the time we're finished, you'll be portrayed as a delusional conspiracy theorist whose fabricated evidence caused unnecessary panic and interfered with proper medical treatment of sick children. The agent moved toward the door, then paused. Oh, and Mr. Carter, if you choose the uncooperative path, you should know that we've already prepared alternative explanations for the children's illnesses: industrial contamination from a chemical plant, illegal dumping of household toxins, even a possible bioterrorism incident. All of these explanations avoid any mention of federal nuclear waste disposal. Brandon realized he was witnessing the final phase of a cover-up that had been refined over 70 years. They had contingency plans for every possible scenario, alternative narratives for every threat to their secret. You've done this before. Many times, Mr. Carter. We've become quite good at it. After Harrison left, Brandon sat in his living room staring at the photo album the agent had been examining. Pictures of Emma at birthday parties, school events, family vacations. A normal childhood that had been shattered by government lies, and was now being held hostage by government threats. Brandon pulled out his phone and called Janet Williams. Janet, it's Brandon. They know about the story. They know when it's going to break, and they're threatening my daughter's life if I don't cooperate with the cover-up. Brandon, the story goes live in 90 minutes. There's no stopping it now. Then, God help us all, because Agent Harrison just made it clear that they're willing to do whatever it takes to discredit the evidence and maintain their secret. As Brandon ended the call, he realized that the next few hours would determine not just Emma's fate, but the fate of thousands of families who had been living unknowingly on contaminated ground for decades. The final battle for the truth was about to begin. At exactly 2 p.m. on a Tuesday that would reshape American politics, the story broke simultaneously across every major news platform in the country. Breaking: government buried nuclear waste under residential neighborhoods for 70 years exclusive. Declassified documents reveal systematic poisoning of American families' radiation cover-up. Children dying from secret nuclear program. Brandon watched the coverage from Emma's hospital room, his phone buzzing constantly with calls from reporters, government officials, and panicked neighbors. The evidence he and Dr. Martinez had compiled was being dissected and analyzed by news teams across the globe. CNN led with Thomas Fletcher's declassified documents, showing the original Operation Plowshare memos that authorized burying plutonium waste in populated areas. The reporter held up photographs of the corroded drums Brandon had discovered, explaining how radiation levels at the site were 300 times higher than safe limits. Fox News focused on the medical crisis, interviewing Dr. Woods about the 14 children currently hospitalized with radiation poisoning symptoms. The camera lingered on Emma's empty hospital bed as Dr. Woods explained how bone marrow suppression in previously healthy children pointed to acute plutonium exposure. MSNBC presented Dr. Martinez's environmental testing results, showing how contamination had spread through groundwater systems to affect an area containing nearly 50,000 residents. Their graphics team had created a devastating visual representation of the contamination. Plume spreading outward from Maple Street like a explosion. Social media exploded with outrage and disbelief. #Maple Street began trending worldwide within an hour of the story's release. Parents in cities across the country began demanding soil testing in their neighborhoods, wondering if their communities might harbor similar secrets. But the government response was swift and coordinated. By 3 p.m., Department of Energy officials were holding press conferences denying the existence of any federal nuclear waste disposal program in residential areas. They characterized Brandon as a disgruntled city worker with a history of erratic behavior, and suggested the evidence had been fabricated to support a lawsuit against the federal government. Agent Harrison appeared on multiple news programs, calmly explaining that the Maple Street site contained trace amounts of naturally occurring radioactive materials that posed no health threat. He suggested that the children's illnesses were likely caused by seasonal allergies or exposure to household cleaning products. The character assassination Brandon had been warned about began immediately. Anonymous sources leaked information about Brandon's financial problems, his daughter's medical expenses, and his supposed obsession with conspiracy theories. Internet trolls flooded social media with claims that he had planted fake evidence to collect damages from a government lawsuit. But Brandon and Dr. Martinez had prepared for this response. They had distributed copies of the evidence to hundreds of journalists, environmental groups, and legal organizations. Every attempt to discredit one piece of evidence was met with confirmation from multiple independent sources. Thomas Fletcher, despite his age and illness, appeared on national television with decades of government documents proving the systematic cover-up. His credibility as a career EPA inspector made it impossible to dismiss him as a conspiracy theorist. By evening, congressional leaders from both parties were demanding immediate investigations. The Attorney General announced the formation of a special task force to examine the allegations. International news organizations began reporting on what they called America's Chernobyl. But the most powerful moment came when Dr. Woods held an impromptu press conference outside the Children's Hospital. "I have 14 children in my care suffering from acute radiation poisoning," she said, her voice shaking with anger. While government officials debate the credibility of evidence and the motives of whistleblowers, these children are fighting for their lives. They need immediate specialized treatment, not political spin. As Brandon watched the coverage, his phone rang. It was Sarah, calling from Emma's bedside. "Brandon, something's happening. A team of specialists just arrived from the CDC. They say they're here to begin emergency treatment protocols for radiation exposure." Agent Harrison's people. "No, these are different. Real doctors, not government handlers. They're talking about chelation therapy, bone marrow support, everything Dr. Woods has been asking for." Brandon felt a surge of hope. The public exposure was forcing the government to abandon its strategy of medical obstruction. They could no longer prevent proper treatment without confirming the very contamination they were trying to deny. "How's Emma responding?" "It's too early to tell, but her fever broke about an hour ago." The doctors seemed cautiously optimistic. As Brandon hung up, he realized that going public had already accomplished something Agent Harrison's threats never could have. The truth had a power that transcended political calculations and bureaucratic damage control. The cover-up was crumbling, and the children were finally getting the medical attention they deserved. But Brandon knew this was just the beginning. Exposing the truth was one thing. Forcing accountability and preventing future cover-ups would be a much longer and more difficult battle. The evacuation order came at 6 a.m., just 4 days after the story broke. Federal emergency management officials, accompanied by hazmat teams and military personnel, began the process of relocating 8,000 residents from the immediate contamination zone. Brandon stood on his front porch, watching neighbors load their lives into moving trucks. Their faces a mixture of fear, anger, and confusion. Many had lived on Maple Street for decades, raising families and building memories in houses that were now declared uninhabitable. Mrs. Chen approached him with tears in her eyes, carrying a suitcase and leading Tommy by the hand. The boy looked better than he had in weeks, thanks to the specialized medical treatment that had finally been authorized after the public disclosure. "Brandon, I don't know whether to thank you or blame you," she said. "Tommy's getting better, but we're losing everything. Our house, our neighborhood, our whole life here." Brandon understood her conflicted feelings. The revelation that had saved the children's lives had also destroyed the community they'd grown up in. Property values had collapsed overnight. Mortgages, uncontaminated land would never be paid off. Families were scattered to temporary housing across the metropolitan area. "I know this is hard, Helen, but Tommy's alive. All the children are going to be okay now, are they? The doctors say the radiation exposure could cause problems for years, maybe decades. Cancer risks, fertility issues, immune system damage. What kind of life are we giving them?" Before Brandon could respond, a group of his neighbors approached from across the street. Their expressions were hostile, and he recognized the signs of people looking for someone to blame. "This is your fault, Carter," shouted Jim Martinez, Sophia's father. "We were fine until you started digging around where you didn't belong. Now look at us, homeless because of your conspiracy theories." "They weren't conspiracy theories, Jim. The contamination was real. The children were getting sick. Sophia had a rash." "A rash. Now, you've got federal agents crawling all over our neighborhood, our property values destroyed, and my family living in a hotel room. Was it worth it?" Other neighbors nodded in agreement, their anger finding focus in Brandon's presence. He realized that many of them would rather have lived with the hidden danger than face the chaos of exposure and evacuation. The situation grew more tense when a news van pulled up, its camera crew immediately focusing on the confrontation. The reporter, a young woman with perfectly styled hair, thrust a microphone toward Brandon. "Mr. Carter, how do you respond to neighbors who blame you for destroying their community?" I respond by pointing out that 14 children were hospitalized with radiation poisoning, Brandon said firmly. The community was already destroyed by 70 years of government lies. All I did was expose the truth, but critics say you could have worked with federal authorities to address the contamination quietly, without creating public panic. Brandon thought about Agent Harrison's threats, about the government's willingness to let children die rather than admit their mistakes. There's no quiet way to address 70 years of systematic poisoning. The authorities had their chance to handle this responsibly. They chose cover-up instead. As the interview continued, Brandon noticed federal agents moving through the crowd, recording conversations and taking photographs. The surveillance that had begun with a few men in dark suits had now expanded to encompass the entire evacuation effort. The political backlash was equally intense. Congressional hearings had been announced, but they were structured to focus on Brandon's irresponsible disclosure, rather than the government's decades of deception. Politicians from both parties condemned the reckless release of classified information, while offering only token acknowledgement of the underlying contamination problem. Agent Harrison appeared on multiple news programs, expressing sympathy for the affected families while subtly suggesting that the crisis could have been avoided if Brandon had worked within official channels. He never acknowledged that those official channels had been systematically covering up the contamination for 70 years. The most disturbing development came from an unexpected source. Dr. Martinez called Brandon with news that made his blood run cold. "Brandon, they're coming after the evidence. Federal marshals showed up at my laboratory this morning with court orders to seize all materials related to the Maple Street investigation." "On what grounds?" "National security. They're claiming that our environmental testing methods could be used to locate other classified disposal sites, making our research a threat to homeland security." Brandon felt a familiar chill. The government was still trying to control the narrative, still working to limit the scope of disclosure and prevent further revelations about Operation Plowshare. What about Thomas Fletcher's documents? "They raided his house yesterday, confiscated everything under the Espionage Act. He's been charged with unauthorized retention of classified materials." The scope of the government's counterattack was becoming clear. They couldn't suppress the story anymore, but they could criminalize the people who had exposed it, seize the evidence that supported it, and gradually regain control of the information flow. That evening, as Brandon sat in his empty house watching the last of his neighbors load their belongings, his phone rang. The caller ID showed Agent Harrison's number. "Mr. Carter, I hope you're satisfied with the results of your disclosure. Thousands of families displaced, a community destroyed, economic chaos that will take years to resolve, children's lives saved, government accountability restored, public health protected." Brandon replied, "For now, perhaps, but this story has a long arc. Mr. Carter, public attention will fade, political priorities will shift, and when the cameras go away, when the congressional committees move on to other issues, we'll still be here. We'll still be managing situations that require discretion and institutional knowledge." Brandon understood the implicit threat. The government would outlast public outrage, would adapt and continue, would find new ways to keep the secrets that people like Brandon tried to expose. Maybe, but the truth is out there now. You can't put it back in the box, can't we? "We'll see, Mr. Carter, we'll see." As Brandon hung up, he realized that exposing the Maple Street cover-up was only the first battle in a much longer war for government transparency and accountability. The question was whether the American people would stay engaged long enough to win it. 6 months after the story broke, Brandon sat at a witness table in the Hart Senate office building, facing a panel of senators who had the power to hold the government accountable for 7 decades of lies. The hearing room was packed with reporters, affected families, and government officials who had spent months preparing their defense strategies. Senator Patricia Williams, the committee chair, opened with a statement that captured the scope of the scandal. "Mr. Carter, your discovery has led to the identification of 43 nuclear waste disposal sites in residential areas across 12 states. We now know that Operation Plowshare affected over 200,000 American citizens, with documented health impacts spanning 3 generations." Brandon looked out at the gallery and saw Emma sitting in the front row with Sarah. His daughter looked healthy for the first time in months, her radiation-induced symptoms finally responding to proper medical treatment, but the doctors had warned that the long-term effects of plutonium exposure could take years to fully manifest. "Senator Williams, I want to be clear about something," Brandon said as he leaned toward the microphone. "I didn't discover anything that the government didn't already know. Every fact that has emerged in the past 6 months, every piece of evidence that shocked the American people, every health risk that we're now addressing, all of this was documented in classified reports, going back decades." He pulled out a folder containing some of Thomas Fletcher's declassified documents. The government knew in 1978 that containment was failing at multiple sites. They knew in 1985 that children were developing cancer at elevated rates. They knew in 1994 that groundwater contamination was spreading. They chose to cover it up rather than fix it. Senator James Burke, the ranking minority member, leaned forward with a skeptical expression. "Mr. Carter, while we all sympathize with the affected families, don't you think there's a responsibility to work within established channels, rather than creating public panic through unauthorized disclosures? Brandon felt a familiar surge of anger. Senator, the established channels had 70 years to address this problem. Those channels produced nothing but lies and cover-ups while children got sick and died. What exactly should I have done? Filed a complaint with the same EPA that had been covering up the contamination since the 1970s? There are whistleblower protections, oversight mechanisms, congressional notification procedures, all of which would have been classified, buried, or ignored. Just like every other attempt to expose this program over the past 7 decades, Dr. Martinez, who had been called as an expert witness, provided devastating testimony about the scope of the contamination and the government's systematic efforts to suppress medical research in affected areas. Senators, we now have evidence that federal agencies actively discouraged medical professionals from investigating unusual cancer clusters in these neighborhoods. The CDC classified health data that could have saved lives. The EPA buried environmental studies that documented dangerous contamination levels. This wasn't just negligence, it was active obstruction of public health efforts. The most compelling testimony came from Dr. Patricia Woods, who described the government's interference with medical treatment for radiation-exposed children. I had Department of Energy officials in my hospital discouraging me from treating children for radiation poisoning because it would confirm the existence of contamination. They were willing to let children suffer and potentially die to maintain their cover-up. But the hearing's most dramatic moment came when Thomas Fletcher, now facing federal charges for espionage, took the stand despite his lawyer's advice. I spent 30 years documenting this cover-up because I believed that someday, someone would have the courage to make it public, the elderly former EPA inspector said, his voice weak but determined. I watched families destroyed by preventable diseases while my own government chose politics over public health. If exposing that truth makes me a criminal, then I'm proud to be one. The senators questioned Fletcher about his decision to retain classified documents after retirement. Mr. Fletcher, you violated federal law by keeping those materials. Senator, I violated federal law to preserve evidence of federal crimes. Which violation do you think history will judge more harshly? The hearing lasted 3 days and produced a bipartisan committee report that was devastating in its conclusions. The government had indeed operated a clandestine nuclear waste disposal program in residential areas. Officials had systematically covered up evidence of contamination and health impacts. Agencies had interfered with medical treatment and environmental research too. Maintained their secret, but the recommendations were less satisfying than the findings. Enhanced oversight procedures, better whistleblower protections, reformed classification, policies, all important reforms, but none that would bring back the families who had died from preventable cancers or compensate the communities that had been destroyed. The criminal referrals were limited in scope. A few mid-level officials faced charges for obstruction of justice. Some retired executives lost their pensions, but the systemic nature of the cover-up made it impossible to hold any single person accountable for 7 decades of institutional deception. Agent Harrison was conspicuously absent from the proceedings. He had been reassigned to other duties and declined to testify despite repeated requests from the committee. As Brandon left the hearing room on the final day, he was approached by Senator Williams. Mr. Carter, I want you to know that this committee's work will continue. We're going to make sure that something like this can never happen again. Brandon appreciated the sentiment, but he had learned to be skeptical of promises from government officials. Senator, with respect, committees and oversight procedures didn't prevent this cover-up in the first place. The only thing that exposed it was ordinary citizens willing to risk everything to tell the truth. What would you recommend? Brandon thought about Emma, about the other children who were still recovering, about the families scattered across the country who were dealing with the aftermath of government deception. Sunshine, Senator. Transparency classification systems that protect legitimate national security interests, not bureaucratic embarrassment, and maybe most importantly, protection for people who are willing to expose government wrongdoing, even when it's inconvenient for politicians. As Brandon walked out of the Capitol building and into the bright Washington sunlight, he realized that the hearing had been both a victory and a disappointment. The truth was finally official, acknowledged by the highest levels of government, but truth without accountability was just another form of political theater. The real question was whether the American people would demand more than congressional reports and bureaucratic reforms, whether they would insist on actual justice for the families who had paid the price for 70 years of government lies. 1 year after the congressional hearings, the massive cleanup operation at Maple Street had become a symbol of both government accountability and bureaucratic inefficiency. Brandon stood at the edge of what had once been his neighborhood, watching heavy machinery excavate tons of contaminated soil while workers in full radiation suits carefully removed the corroded drums that had poisoned his community. The federal cleanup effort was the largest environmental remediation project in American history, with costs approaching $50 billion. Every house in the contamination zone had been demolished. The contaminated soil was being shipped to a secure facility in Nevada. New drainage systems were being installed to prevent further groundwater contamination, but the human cost couldn't be measured in dollars or engineering achievements. Brandon's phone buzzed with a text from Sarah. Emma's 6-month checkup is clean, no signs of cancer. Doctor says her prognosis is excellent. The medical news had been largely positive. All 14 children who had been hospitalized with acute radiation poisoning had responded well to treatment. Long-term monitoring programs had been established, and specialized cancer screening protocols had been implemented for all affected residents. Dr. Martinez approached from the command center that had been established to coordinate the cleanup. She was now serving as the senior environmental consultant for the remediation effort, overseeing the scientific aspects of a project that would take another 3 years to complete. Brandon, I wanted you to see the final contamination maps, she said, holding up a tablet displaying color-coded soil analysis results. The good news is that we've successfully contained the spread. The bad news is that the contamination was more extensive than we initially realized. The maps showed hot spots of radioactivity extending nearly 8 miles from the original disposal site, following groundwater flows and old creek beds that had carried contaminated runoff throughout the watershed. How many more families? We've identified approximately 3,000 additional properties with elevated radiation levels, not immediately dangerous, but above safe long-term exposure limits. Those families are being offered voluntary relocation with full compensation. Brandon studied the maps, thinking about all the families who had unknowingly lived on contaminated land for decades. Any word on the other sites? Remediation is beginning at 6 of the most contaminated locations. The others are still tied up in legal and political battles. Some local communities are fighting the cleanup efforts, afraid that publicity will destroy their property values. The nationwide scope of Operation Plowshare had created political and logistical challenges that made the Maple Street situation look simple. Communities in Ohio, Nevada, Tennessee, and other states were grappling with the revelation that they had been unknowingly living near nuclear waste dumps. Some embraced cleanup efforts, while others preferred to maintain the status quo rather than face the disruption of remediation. Thomas Fletcher had become a reluctant hero, testifying before congressional committees and environmental organizations despite ongoing federal charges against him. His legal case had become a cause célèbre for government transparency advocates, but the outcome remained uncertain. Brandon's own legal situation was more complex. The government had filed civil lawsuits seeking to recover the costs of the cleanup, claiming that his unauthorized disclosure had forced them to implement expensive remediation measures that could have been handled more cheaply through quiet negotiations. Brandon, there's something else, Dr. Martinez said, lowering her voice. I've been contacted by families from other sites, places that haven't been publicly identified yet. They're asking for help documenting contamination, exposing covers that are still active. Brandon felt a familiar mixture of excitement and dread. How many sites are we talking about? Based on the declassified documents Thomas provided, potentially dozens. Operation Plowshare was much larger than what's been publicly acknowledged. The implications were staggering. If the Maple Street revelation had exposed only a fraction of the government's secret nuclear waste disposal program, there could be hundreds of thousands of additional people living unknowingly on contaminated land. What do they want me to do? What you did here. Help them document the contamination, connect with environmental researchers, find ways to expose the truth without becoming targets of government retaliation. Brandon looked out at the cleanup operation, the millions of dollars being spent to address a problem that could have been solved decades ago if the government had been honest about what it had done. Dr. Martinez, I'm not sure I'm the right person for that kind of work. This whole experience has taken everything out of me. My family, my career, my faith in the system. I'm not sure I have another fight like this in me. I understand, but Brandon, you've become a symbol for people who feel powerless against government secrecy. Families who are watching their children get sick and don't know why. Communities that suspect they're being lied to but don't know how to prove it. That evening, Brandon sat in his temporary apartment reviewing legal documents related to his ongoing battles with the federal government. The lawsuits would likely take years to resolve, and the financial stress was enormous. But there was also news that gave him hope. A bipartisan group of senators had introduced legislation that would strengthen whistleblower protections and create new transparency requirements for government environmental programs. The bill was being called the Maple Street Act, and it had strong public support. Emma knocked on his office door, holding her homework and looking healthier than she had in over a year. Dad, can you help me with my science project? I'm supposed to write about environmental protection. As Brandon looked at his daughter, he realized that the choice Dr. Martinez had presented him wasn't really a choice at all. Emma and children, like her, deserved to grow up in a world where governments couldn't secretly poison communities and cover up the consequences for decades. The fight wasn't over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But looking at Emma's bright, healthy face, Brandon knew it was a fight worth continuing. The truth had power, even when it came at a terrible personal cost. And sometimes, especially then, It was the most important fight of all. 2 years after Brandon Carter discovered a mysterious hatch in a storm drain, he stood in a community garden built where the Maple Street neighborhood had once existed. The contaminated houses were gone, the poisoned soil had been removed, and new earth had been brought in to create a memorial park honoring the families who had been affected by 70 years of government deception. Emma ran ahead on the walking path, chasing butterflies among the native wildflowers that had been planted throughout the space. At 15, she showed no lingering effects from her radiation exposure, though she would continue medical monitoring for the rest of her life. Her latest blood work had been completely normal, and her oncologist was cautiously optimistic about her long-term prognosis. "Dad, look," Emma called from beside a bronze plaque embedded in a granite memorial wall. "They put Mrs. Chun's name on here." Brandon walked over and read the inscription. Helen Chen, 1967 to 2024. Community activist who demanded truth and accountability. Her courage helped expose one of the largest environmental cover-ups in American history. Mrs. Chen had died 6 months earlier from cancer that may or may not have been related to her decades of exposure to contamination from the buried nuclear waste. The connection would never be proven definitively, but her death had galvanized the affected community and strengthened their resolve to hold the government accountable. Dr. Martinez approached from the memorial's information center, where she now worked as the director of a new environmental monitoring foundation funded by the government settlement. The foundation's mission was to provide independent oversight of cleanup efforts and to assist other communities dealing with similar contamination issues. "Brandon, I have some news that I think you'll want to hear," she said, holding up her tablet. The Maple Street Act was signed into law yesterday. Enhanced whistleblower protections, mandatory disclosure of environmental hazards, and criminal penalties for officials who cover up contamination that threatens public health. Brandon felt a surge of satisfaction. The legislation wouldn't bring back the people who had died from preventable cancers, but it might prevent future cover-ups from lasting 7 decades. Any word on the other sites? Cleanup has begun at 12 locations and communities. At 6 more sites have been notified about contamination. It's slow progress, but it's progress. The broader Operation Plowshare revelations had indeed uncovered dozens of additional contamination sites across the country. Some communities had embraced cleanup efforts, while others were still fighting legal battles with the federal government. The political and financial challenges were enormous, but the precedent set by Maple Street had made complete denial impossible. Thomas Fletcher had been posthumously pardoned for his espionage charges. He had died peacefully in his sleep 3 months after testifying before his final congressional committee, leaving behind a foundation dedicated to government transparency and environmental justice. Agent Harrison had quietly retired from government service and now worked as a consultant for corporations dealing with environmental liability issues. He had never publicly acknowledged his role in the Maple Street cover-up, but his name appeared in hundreds of declassified documents as someone who had actively worked to suppress evidence of contamination. As Brandon and Emma walked through the memorial garden, they came upon a section dedicated to the children who had been affected by the radiation exposure. 14 plaques honored the young victims, including photos showing them before they became sick. "Do you ever regret it, Dad?" Emma asked as they stood before the memorial. Opening that hatch, starting all this, Brandon thought about the question that had haunted him for 2 years. His decision to investigate the mysterious federal installation had cost his family their home, their community, and their sense of security. It had led to congressional hearings, lawsuits, and a level of public scrutiny that had been overwhelming at times. But it had also saved lives, including Emma's. "No, sweetheart, I don't regret it. Truth is sometimes painful, but lies are always more dangerous in the long run." Emma nodded, her teenage wisdom reflecting an understanding that had been forged by experiences no child should have to endure. "Besides," Brennan continued, "look around. This place exists because people were willing to demand the truth, even when it was hard. Mrs. Chen, Dr. Martinez, Mr. Fletcher, all the families who refused to stay quiet. They made this memorial possible." As they walked toward the memorial's centerpiece, Brennan read the words inscribed on a large granite stone: "In memory of those who suffered from Operation Plowshare, and in honor of those who had the courage to expose the truth, may this serve as a reminder that government secrecy must never again take precedence over public health." Brandon's phone buzzed with a call from Dr. Martinez's assistant. A family in Colorado had contacted the foundation about unusual cancer rates in their neighborhood. Initial soil tests had detected elevated radiation levels. They needed someone with experience in documenting contamination and navigating government stonewalling. "Dad," Emma noticed his expression. "Is everything okay?" Brandon looked at his daughter, healthy and strong despite everything she had endured. Then he looked at the memorial garden, a testament to what could be accomplished when ordinary people refuse to accept lies from their own government. "Everything's fine, Em. In fact, I think everything's just getting started." As the sun set behind the memorial garden, Brandon realized that his work was far from over. There were other families and other communities who deserved to know if they were living on contaminated land. There were other government secrets that needed to be exposed before they could cause more harm. The hatch that had started it all was long gone, buried under tons of clean soil and native plants. But the truth it had revealed continued to spread, creating accountability where there had been deception, healing where there had been harm, and hope where there had been despair. Brandon Carter had started as a city maintenance worker who stumbled onto a government secret. He had become something much more important, a reminder that in America, ordinary citizens still had the power to hold their government accountable, no matter how long the lies had been maintained or how powerful the people telling them the truth. Once released, could never be completely contained, and sometimes, that was enough to change the world.